Hello, good afternoon. Warm welcome from AHDB to the Milling Wheat Conference, this year taking the form of Milling Wheat Week, a series of 3 webinars running today, tomorrow and Thursday, all at 1 o'clock. Today we have the Technical Insights webinar, but just before we do that, a little bit of housekeeping for me to run through. You're all muted. We're due to finish round about 2 o'clock. We think it might be slightly after. The webinar is being recorded, so you can catch up with it all afterwards. If you want to ask questions, and I hope that you will, if you look at the right-hand side of your screen, there should be a control box. In there, there are some grey stripes. One of those should list the questions. If you click on that, you can open up the question tab and you can type your questions in there. CPD points are available for this, Basis and Rosso. You'll need to fill a form in. You can get that from the handout section. That's in the same grey control panel. Please do that, or alternatively, you can complete the CPD form, which will be sent after the event. And now then, to introduce our chair for the session today, I think many of you will know, arable farmer, agronomist, and himself a former award-winning cereal grower. I'm delighted to welcome Alex Wilcox. Thank you, Alex.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this AHDB Milling Wheat webinar. All very strange times. Just to briefly introduce myself, my name's Alex Wilcox. I'm a professional agronomist by trade and also farm in my own right. I've been doing agronomy now for 20 some odd years, and we've been farming since 2003. Really interesting topics to cover today, primarily the efficient utilization of nitrogen, which I think is going to become a more and more important point of agronomy going forward over the next 5 to 10 years, particularly with the introduction of potentially more restrictions on urea use, etc. So we've got some brilliant speakers today, and hopefully you enjoy that. Please put your questions in your dialogue boxes. When we get to the end, we've only got an hour, but it's not set in stone. When we get to the end, we'll go through these questions, and I think if we overrun a little bit, it's not the end of the world. So with no further ado, to introduce our first speaker, which is Henry Weber. He's a policy advisor for DEFRA, and he's got a presentation on sustainable nitrogen management. I'll hand over to you, Henry.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alex. Yeah, my name's Henry Weber. I've been working for DEFRA for about 3 years, working on fertiliser policy and nutrient management across a range of different areas, from legislation through to other policy levers and incentives. So today my talk is going to be about sustainable nitrogen management, and I thought it would be quite good just to set out a bit of a higher level context for why nitrogen is important, and why we've got some successes to look at from the past, but also some challenges moving forwards to the future. So next slide, please. So to start off with the really big picture, I'm sure many of you will know these are the Sustainable Development Goals set out by the UN. These are 17 high-level targets for how societies can essentially become more sustainable in the future. Now, one thing to notice is that traditionally, if you're thinking about nitrogen and wheat perhaps and food production, you may be focusing on a few of those goals. But the point I wanted to raise really is that I think nitrogen is actually essential to all of those goals. Nitrogen is an essential element. It's not just about food production, it's about all living organisms. And so therefore societies also rely on the functioning of nitrogen and nitrogen cycling within nutrient management sort of cycles to develop and to live. So I think that's really nice just to set out how important nitrogen is in this much wider picture of sustainable development. Next slide, please. So to take that down one step, from the UN level and perhaps the sort of principles of sustainable development and those goals. These are two diagrams which I sort of use to explain how they relate to land management in a more practical level. So the diagram on the left there is the ecosystem services sort of complex. Each one of those shows how land and I guess the air and the soil and the water all merge together into a series of systems. And if you change one element of that system, it can have ripples and effects in other areas of those systems. They're all interconnected, interlinked. And so thinking about nitrogen being integrated into all of those, we have to be really careful about how nitrogen is managed, how it's applied, looking at those inputs and outputs and where losses in that system might occur. And one other example on the right-hand side is a circular sort of diagram showing it was produced, I think, from an Agritech East conference in 2019, just to show how interconnected agriculture is with society, soils, crops, and it attempted to bring together more integrated policy making with research, with knowledge exchange, to design better approaches to managing this than perhaps what has been done in the past. And that's one thing that we're looking at the moment within DEFRA. Obviously, with having left the EU and making the most of options and opportunities going forwards, I think there's a lot of interest in evaluating how these things have worked in the past and how we could actually improve them going forwards into the future. Next slide, please, Amanda. So bringing that down again into another level, into the sort of national sphere, we've obviously got a number of national priorities from a policy perspective and specifically within DEFRA. The first of these, I guess, is net zero. That's one of the biggest challenges, which is obviously now enshrined in law by 2050. But we also have a selection of other policies around the environment, around food production and the development of a food strategy, which is occurring at the moment with Henry Dimbleby's review that is ongoing, but also the clean air strategy. And Alex mentioned obviously the urea consultation that's just recently closed on that, but then also linking it into the economy and the clean growth strategy. How do we green the economy while improving the environment and maintaining that level of productivity? This sort of, again, this nexus of policies is reflective of that higher level picture of all the wider goals. Next slide, please. So I'm sure many of you will know this, but nitrogen is obviously important. It's obviously key in a number of things, and three of those are suggested on the slide: the chlorophyll production and therefore essential for photosynthesis in plants, but also a component in nucleic acids in DNA and in proteins and amino acids. These are the fundamental building blocks of life, and that's why it's just incredibly important to manage appropriately. But it's also about managing all the different forms that nitrogen can take. It sounds simple when you just say that it's nitrogen, but when you think about all of the different ways that nitrogen can either be fixed by plants, for example, on the left there, the biological fixation through rhizobia, through to then capturing nitrogen in the air into mineral bagged fertilizers, whether it's ammonium nitrate or urea, and then going through into the organic side, thinking about all of the different mineral organic forms of N that can be used within production systems, but also contribute to this more complex nitrogen cycle. Next slide, please. So here's a bit of a picture there of the nitrogen cycle in its totality. Obviously, there's an awful lot going on. There's a lot of places where nitrogen can be lost to the air. There's a lot of places where it can be combined and transformed within the soil. Animals and humans and plants are obviously key mediators between all of that system. And each one of these sorts of processes can also happen at different times, some being dependent on soil temperature, some being dependent on rainfall. It is a very complex process. So next slide, please. And because it's so essential in all of these different parts of the system, it's also quite leaky. This is a diagram from the EU's nitrogen expert panel, just to show with a production system, thinking about an agricultural production system. Obviously, we're putting inputs in and we're getting outputs out, but what's happening in the middle? You know, there's a lot of efficiencies that will be quite variable between perhaps crop-based systems and livestock-based systems, and then you've got the mixed systems in between will have a varying amount of both. So understanding where those losses are, where those inefficiencies in parts of the system are, will be quite key, I think, in going forwards to sort of manage nitrogen more sustainably, because you can't manage it more sustainably if you don't know where your losses are going or where your inefficiencies are. Next slide, please. But while I've been focusing on quite a lot of global challenges and some of the national priorities, I did want to really make sure that we cover off some of the successes that have been had when we look at it over a longer period of time. So the two graphs here from some of the DEFRA survey statistics, on the left, the British Survey fertiliser practice, which shows over the last 20, 30 years, the drop in average kilogram per hectare nutrient applications, so nitrogen being the top line there on the graph. And we can see that reduction over time, which is reflective of better practice, better nutrient management, and being reflected in the graph on the right-hand side as well, which actually shows yields between the year 2000 and 2020. And it's really important to combine those two parts together, because a reduction in use is great, but it's got to be combined with either an equal amount of yield, or if we could increase yield, that would be fantastic. But that shows that we have reduced use. We have plateaued in the yields, but we've maintained a certain yield, which shows that our efficiency has gone up overall. Next slide, please. So still, in terms of the environmental challenges that are still with us despite that increase in efficiency, there are a number of areas that obviously are of concern. 86% of English rivers did not reach good ecological status in 2016, which is quite a large proportion. Obviously, ammonia emissions is another big concern at the moment, with legally binding commitments to reduce ammonia emissions. Obviously, the government needs to be relatively strong in ensuring that there is action against ammonia. But also it's the harmful effects that come from some of those ammonia products in terms of volatilization and particulate matter, which can also be shown to damage plants, especially combinable crops, through deposition of nitrogen in the form of particulates. And also another statistic from another farm practices survey of DEFRA's, 57% of holdings had a nutrient management plan in 2019, which I think, because it's seen as being a baseline of nutrient management planning, that figure really probably ought to be a bit higher, and that's something that we do need to work on going forwards. Next slide, please. So one of the key things that I thought would be really useful to bring out from all of what I've said just previously is about really managing and budgeting your nitrogen, looking at where you can increase efficiencies using any of the tools within the box, which I'm sure we'll hear about later in terms of how growers can increase the efficiency, whether it's in maintaining or improving soil health, whether it's using biostimulants or whether it's using inhibitors. There are obviously a whole menagerie of methods to do this, but ultimately what we're trying to get to is a more efficient use of nitrogen, which is taking account of the harvested crop and the nitrogen applied, or the harvest output, perhaps, if you're thinking about livestock in those systems. So I think going forwards into the future, it will be fundamental for farms to be able to demonstrate how efficiently nutrients are being used, because it helps in terms of the economic baseline, making sure that you are being productive, you're not wasting money on obviously on fertilizer or nutrients that aren't necessary, but also you're making use of those resources in the most sort of environmentally efficient way as well. The flexibility of these sorts of calculations is interesting, because you of course could do it on a field level, on a within field level perhaps, or you go to the farm level and perhaps even regional levels in terms of these budgets. So they're quite scalable, flexible calculations, which if you have the right data and the right information at your hand in terms of yields or soil nutrient levels, they can be quite powerful calculations and help to identify, as I said earlier, where those efficiencies and losses are. But it's also important to link those with other things such as phosphorus and carbon, or perhaps other nutrients, just to make sure you're getting a full picture of where that nitrogen is going. Next slide, please. So my last slide really is about a plea for us all to work together, I think, in the time of change. We understand as policymakers that we need to work with everybody in the sector. I think there are lots of challenges, but as I said, there's some successes. There are some good news stories, and I think we can build on that in the future. And we'll need to, because of the risks of extreme weather, for example, making it even more difficult to manage nitrogen sustainably. But I think working together and sharing information and best practice and doing benchmarking and things like that is going to be the way forwards. So I think with that, I will end and pass back to you, Alex.
Absolutely brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Henry. So, we're looking there from Henry. Henry's providing us with some goals that we should be looking to achieve in terms of some of his comments on rivers still need improving. 50% of growers are not using nutrient management plans. And when it comes down to it, yes, they are goals, but when you look at nitrogen utilization efficiency, your NUE, it's not just an environmental goal, that's a cost saving to us growers. So a win-win. So on that, I'd like to move on and introduce you to Professor Peter Shewry of Rothamsted Research. And Peter is a very well-read chap on the development and structure on composition of winter wheat, and focusing particularly on improving the quality and processing for human health. And he's going to present to us today on now moving from the goals into potentially achieving them. So is it possible to produce bread-making wheats using reduced levels of nitrogen fertiliser in the UK? So I'll hand you over to Professor Peter Shewry.
Okay, thank you. Firstly, I'm going to apologise you can't see me. We seem to have a problem getting my camera going with this system, although that's no great loss, to be honest. I'm going to talk about a project supported by AHDB. The project report's published, and you'll be getting copies of the slides, I think, afterwards if you want them. So I'm going to move fairly quickly. Could I move on to the next slide, please? What we're interested in is reducing the requirement of nitrogen to the requirement for optimum yield, which means we don't have to add additional nitrogen to increase the grain protein for bread making quality. This is from our classical broad-bulk experiment at Rothamsted, and you see here we're getting our maximum yield in this experiment at around about 200 kilograms of nitrogen, but we have to go above that to get the bread making quality, to get 13% protein. Go to the next slide, please. So interested in the variation in grain nitrogen and grain protein in sort of cultivars, and whether we can exploit this to develop cultivars which perform better at lower nitrogen levels. You can see here the data from a field experiment at Rothamsted. This is Malcolm Hawks's Rudge data over many years at Rothamsted, and a range of cultivars. And you see they vary in the nitrogen content. This is not surprising because some are actually bred for feed, like Savannah heavy wood, and others are bred for bread making. What you can see, there's some variation in stability from year to year. There is a lot of environmental variation, but some varieties are intrinsically more stable than others. Go to the next slide, please. Also, interestingly, if we plot nitrogen or grain protein against yield, we get an inverse correlation, which I'm sure you're all aware of. The interesting thing is that some varieties always fall above this regression line and others fall below. We call this grain protein deviation. And it shows that some varieties are actually better at making use of the nitrogen applied. So some of the varieties above the line they're consistently above the line, it means you put the same amount of nitrogen on, you get more, you get more grain protein, and this is irrespective of the yield. So we're interested in understanding and exploiting grain protein deviation as a way of making better use of nitrogen applied. Go to the next slide, please. So we put together a BBSRC AHDB link project. We started with some money from AHDB. We then went to breeders and to grain processors. We made in-kind contributions, and then we doubled it from BBSRC. So we ended up with a budget of just over £1 million. And academics at Rothamsted, the John Innes Centre, and at Camden BRI doing the milling and some of the bait and some of the functionality testing. And then we had plant breeders, and we had sort of processors, some millers and bakers, and we had agri as an agronomy company. So it looks like a big project. It is a big project, but it's still expensive to do this type of work. Go to the next slide. So the strategy was to actually compare selected genotypes of milling and baking at low fertiliser application. And we chose 150 kilograms per hectare. We also had a higher nitrogen level, but we did most of the work at the low nitrogen level. We grew them on multiple sites, and we had them milled by Camden and then baked by the partners. And we started with 40 sort of varieties, and we went down from 40 to 30 and from 30 to 20 in successive years. So we had 3 years field trials, reducing the number of varieties down. We did underpinning studies on gluten protein composition at Rothamsted and Camden. We also looked at grain protein deviation, and we had a parallel project at the John Innes Centre to work with QTLs, sort of genes for quality from a cross that we worked with previously to produce a sort of single super wheat combining these QTLs. I won't be talking about that today. Go to the next slide, please. So this was a strategy, 2015-16, 40 genotypes, multi-site trials, 150 and 250 kilograms per nitrogen, milled by Camden, and then analysed by the bakers. These we selected, well, we grew the same 40 genotypes for the second year, but when we harvested the second year, we only harvested 30 of them, well, we selected 30 of them. And these 30, again, we milled and we analysed. We planted the same 30 in the third year. While they were growing, we did the analyses, and at the end of that, we selected 20. So we have 1 year's data with 40, then 30, and then 20. This was to reduce the amount of work required, particularly for the milling and baking, which is expensive work for the partners to carry out. Go to the next slide, please. The varieties, we picked a range of varieties, some of the Nabim Group 1 and Group 4, Group 2 varieties, some spring wheats, some miscellaneous wheats for various reasons, Hungarian high protein wheats, some German wheats which have been bred to perform well at low protein content for bread making, a couple of hybrids from Southern Union, and then some French Danish wheats and a few genetic stocks. So quite a range of material. Go to the next slide, please. Now I'm going to give you a sort of snapshot of some of the data. I can't go into it in detail, but it's all in the report, so you can have the slides afterwards. But this shows the varieties, just arranged in this case alphabetically, from left to right, at the 150, 250 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and the 3 years, 2016, 17, 18. At the top we're showing the yields, at the bottom we're showing the grain nitrogen contents. Of course, we have a lot of variation from year to year. This is the means for all the sites. So normally for 5 or 6 sites, although we couldn't include all sites all years, we have 1 or 2 problems. We have some deer damage. We have sort of problems with establishment on 1 or 2 sites in certain years. But having 6 sites meant we had a lot of data to work with. And of course, you do get genetic variation in the yield and in the nitrogen content. And I think, again, a thing to notice is that some of the varieties appear to be more stable than others. If you look at the grain nitrogen content, particularly, some show quite a lot of variation, others appear to be more stable. And stability is, I think, is going to be very important going forward. Go to the next slide, please. We also looked at GPD, and we started looking for varieties which show grain protein deviation, i.e. they're better at putting nitrogen into the grain and making protein, irrespective of yield. And you can see 1 or 2 stand out as having high GPD. On the left-hand panel, the 150 kilograms of nitrogen, you see one stands out above all the others. This is a actually a Hungarian high protein wheat, so that's not really surprising. But we do have variation, and the variation is very largely genetically determined, or at least partly genetically determined. And you can see that, I think, looking at this, some varieties are consistently high, others consistently low. I'll come back to this later. So the next slide, please. The way we study quality. First, we did the milling at Camden. We used a Bueller mill, and then Camden did Farinagraph and Extensograph to provide a basis for the millers and the bakers to do their baking tests and their rheology tests. We looked at quality by size exclusion HPLC, and this was again done at Camden, and it was analysed using a system which they have set up, which is probably the best system you can use for it. And what the system does, it separates the gluten proteins sort of based on their size, and it separates the polymers. You can see what we call the F1 peak here on the left, from the monomers, the gliadins, and from other proteins, sort of intermediate size polymers. The F1 peak is large glutenin polymers, and we know that's associated with good bread making quality. We also know the ratio of the polymers to the monomers, so that's the F1 plus F2 over F3 plus F4 to the large peaks compared to the small peaks. They're also associated with bread making quality, the gliadin to glutenin ratio. So we particularly looked at those ratios. Go to the next slide, please. We also measured the dough rheology using the Extensograph at Camden. That Extensograph, you make a dough and then you rest it and then you stretch it and you measure the resistance and the extensibility. And the resistance to the extension you can see is the line going up on the graph there, and the extensibility, the amount it stretches, is shown on the bottom. Effectively, you stretch it until it breaks, and when it breaks, you see the red line comes down. And the resistance over extensibility tells you really the ratio of dough strength to dough viscosity to dough extensibility. So we measured the R over E for all the lines, and that was done at Camden. And having done these measurements, they then could give the flour to the millers and bakers, and they could do their own in-house analyses on them. Go to the next slide, please. We had 6 sort of baking partners: ADM, Whitworths, Allied, Hovis, Warburtons, and Haygates, and they used 3 different bread making methods. ADM and Whitworths used spiral white. Allied, Hovis, and Warburtons used CBP, Chorley wood, and Haygates used a bulk fermentation system. Having said that, some of them use the same systems. In fact, they're all slightly different. So they're all in-house systems. So the 2 spiral systems weren't exactly the same, and the 3 CBP ones weren't exactly the same. So having this range of methods meant that anything that came out of the project should be robust. If we have good quality, it should be reproducible if it comes out with all 3 methods, all the small variations. Go to the next slide, please. So what do they measure? The bakers, they measured mixing time, dough temperature, dough strength, dough extensibility, dough handling, oven spring, so aspects of dough rheology. And they also measured on the right-hand side aspects of the bread quality. They looked at the loaf volume and or the baked height of the loaf. They looked at the crumb color, the crumb texture, the crumb structure. And a lot of this was done using a C-cell analysis system, image analysis system. For the next slide, please. What we wanted to identify was genotypes which perform well at low nitrogen. And the first thing we found was it was actually very difficult to put together the data from the different bread making tests. What we learned really from the project was that all of our bakers were very good at recognizing good varieties. So if we gave them the same material to bake, they come out with pretty well the same list in terms of the quality of the varieties. What wasn't so easy to determine was how they measured that, because they used in-house measurements, and we found there wasn't very good correlation between the methods, between the results of the measurements, but there's very good correlation between the overall quality that they measured. So it tells you quite a lot about baking. I think that baking is as much an art as a science, and a lot of it is experience. But by using a more perhaps less, I was going to say less scientific, it's not less scientific, but it's more an experience-based approach. We can recognize certain varieties which perform well, firstly at high and low nitrogen, so equally good and particularly stable. quite encouragingly, 2 of these were Crusoe and Gallant, which at that time were, were popular UK Group 1 varieties. Also, they recognised a couple of the German varieties called Rum and Nelson, and we included these 2 because they're actually bred for performance at low low grain protein content. So this shows that they've done a good job in Germany, I think, on the breeding for low protein bread making wheats, and also one of the Danish wheats. Then we had another small group, Skyfall and Lucilla. Lucilla is a Hungarian high protein wheat, which were actually better at low nitrogen in our experiments. Go to the next slide, please. So why were they better? Well, as I said earlier, we measured a number of things, including GPD, including the Extensograph, looking at the rheology, and looking at the gluten quality using the site exclusion HPLC system. And the main differences were in GPD. Group 1 and Group 2 varieties both were better at putting nitrogen in the grain than the other varieties. So GPD was statistically higher in the selective varieties. The Extensograph, the dough rheology, they had stronger dough, and also they had a higher ratio of gliadin to glutenin to gliadin. In the case of one of the groups, they also had a higher portion of large glutenin polymers. So it appears that what we were selecting for was material which was actually large, which were good at putting nitrogen into the grain and good at making strong dough or strong gluten. This is probably not rocket science. This is something that we could possibly have predicted. But what it has shown is that we do understand, I think, the basis for performance at low protein content. It's getting better protein, and it's actually getting lines which are actually better at making use of nitrogen producing protein. Go to the next slide, please. Since then, we've spun off a PhD studentship. This was funded by AHDB, and this is really following forward a bit from the LINK project and also from a previous LINK. We had a previous LINK project, FQS 23, and we have a PhD student who's working on identifying QTLs for genes and alleles for GPD and other aspects of quality using this material. He's in the second year of his PhD now, and it's been quite a difficult sort of time for him, as you can probably imagine, with the COVID restrictions. And also we had quite a lot of problems with the weather and getting harvests, getting material planted and harvested, but he's doing a pretty good job at that at the moment. And then finally, I've been asked to remind you of another AHDB project which is relevant, and that's in the next slide. I'm not going to talk about this, but this is a project I've been asked by AHDB to mention, which is the project which they have on nitrogen sulfur management for grain protein in winter milling wheat. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I think we've got time for questions later on. As I say, you do have access to the slides, and you should be able to download the report if you want to read it in detail. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Peter. That was really interesting, looking at the more into the specific details about why we grow particular varieties. And as we've all got to remember, growing milling wheats, we don't grow it because it suits us. We grow it because there's an end market and an end quality, and that's really gives us a bit of an insight into how we actually achieve that. Which brings us on to our last speaker, which is Ian Rudge. He's sorry, I've got a slow connection there. Ignore that. Arable Farms Director of Bedfordia Farms. This is from a practical viewpoint of optimising milling wheat yields in the light of the changing weather, and a grower's perspective on how you go about growing a good milling wheat. I'll hand over to you, Ian.
Thanks very much, Alex. I'll just correct you there. I'm not Farms Director. I'm basically the Arable Operations Manager for Bedfordia Farms. I've been here for 28 years, so I've sort of done my probation. So I'm going to sort of try and give the farmer's view on how to grow milling wheat, or how we've been growing milling wheat. Really interesting stuff from both Henry and from Peter. That's been useful for us to sort of think about. First slide, Amanda. Okay, over the last few years, the weather patterns have not always played ball with what we've wanted to do. We've had 2 back-to-back difficult autumns for establishment, as everybody who is in a practical farming position knows. We've all been trying to give drill dates, the due consideration for blackgrass control to get a stale seed bed, and I think sometimes, you know, we would prefer to be drilling early and get all of our crops established in good conditions with minimal soil damage. But it appears that we're getting some sort of change in extremes of weather that do affect the practical operation in a farming sense. Next slide, please, Amanda. Yields are obviously driven by the weather patterns that we receive through the growing season. And some of these, again, have been challenging. And I think what we've seen in the other presentations today is that in reality, over the last 10 years, 15 years, yields have not consistently improved. They've been sort of plateaued, and they've been driven totally and utterly by the ability to establish a crop in good conditions, to then be able to have the right weather patterns and also use the fertilizer, the nutritional package, and also the agrochemical packages that we use to try and grow consistent outputs. Our average price that we've achieved for this harvest so far has been around about £200 a tonne. Last year, conversely, it was, and our average price was £167 a tonne. We rolled 3,000 tonnes over from last harvest into this year. But as you can see, proteins also in the orange bar have also gone up and down. So we've been feeding the crop for a tonnage, and when we don't achieve that tonnage, in many instances, we see either a rise or a decline in protein. I have to say that up until sort of 2018, we were using an awful lot of organic product in the autumn, but the Diffuse Pollution Act has changed our stance on that. But we are still achieving sort of 40% of our nutritional package comes from an organic source. Next slide, please, Amanda. In our ideal world, this is some solstice. We would all like to get 260 plants per square metre with good tiller survival. And if any of you have been in a yen competition, we are looking to get sort of 700 plus ears at harvest for the perfect situation. A good crop of wheat, or a good crop of anything, is easier to manage than a variable crop. You can justify both the nutritional package, and also you can justify your spend on fungicides and maintenance of it. It's far easier. Plus the competition for weed control is always more pleasurable. The last 2 seasons have certainly tested that resolve of pleasure in farming. Next slide, please, Amanda. So going back to last spring, this time nearly last year, we had around about 600 hectares that hadn't been planted. We had seed in store, and we put in 180 hectares of wheat from the 18th of March. So we thought that should we do this? So in reality, I sowed it in with a horse sprinter with 1-inch Dutch openers, and so this is how it came through. This was at the end of March. Next slide, please, Amanda. In the seed bed, for the Skyfall. This was Skyfall, by the way. In the seed bed, I put 50 kilos of nitrogen and 25 kilos of phosphate to try and increase sort of rooting depth, and then to try and maintain our sort of gross margin. Because of the amount of digestate we're able to use, and because we're only allowed to use it in the spring to any consequence, except for oilseed rape, I put on the remainder of the nitrogen as digestate. So I had a following 140 kilos. So within the digestate, you've got other nutrients, you've got some more phosphate, you've got a very useful amount of potash, and some sulfur, some manganese, and some other trace elements. So I was trying to improve the gross margin compared to spring barley. We also sowed around about 450 hectares of spring barley. Next slide, please, Amanda. So this was the Skyfall just pre-flowering in the same field that we've just seen. The row widths too wide, but we physically, if we'd have cultivated the ground, we'd have just made clods at that time. So were we right? I was panicking a little bit to see whether or not we actually got primordia development and then enough vernalization for it to actually get into flower. So that was a relief from my point of view, as well as my farm's director. Next slide, please, Amanda. So this is the same field. There's a little bit of black grass you can see in the front, but generally the weed control was very good. And on average, on that 180 hectares of spring sown Skyfall, we achieved around about 6 tonne a hectare. The protein was 13.7, so you'd argue that I'd perhaps gone overboard with the nitrogen. With the Hagberg, unfortunately, it was only 225 because of the high level of rainfall that we got in the middle of August. So this was actually harvested around about the 24th of August. But we harvested it before our spring barley, which again, after the rainfall, even though we'd sprayed it off with Roundup, had greened up tremendously, and we just struggled to get that through the combine. Next slide, please, Amanda. We are lucky here at Bedfordia that we actually have a very effective and efficient laboratory, because we do store grain as well for Glencore as well as our own. But actually having the knowledge load by load, field by field, is very important for us to be able to segregate and also know what we're putting and where we're putting it. Next slide, please, Amanda. The grain store has 12,000 tonnes of bin storage. We have good facilities to dry wet grain as necessary, and we can segregate and we can blend out at point of sale. Next slide, please, Amanda. So in my conclusions, which really, again, are following on from what Henry and Peter have said, is, do we believe the weather pattern is changing? I think we're getting extremes. Last year we had a very late harvest, late sowing period in the spring. We were not able to get our nitrogen on at the right time because, again, we weren't able to travel. So therefore tiller survival was difficult to encourage at that point in time. And then it went from one extreme to the other. It became much drier, and if we hadn't have had some rain in late April and another little dose in June, I think our harvest would have been even poorer than what we actually did achieve. We have robust establishment techniques with a stale seed bed. We promote soil structure and soil health. I think with our varietal choice, we grow Crusoe, Skyfall, and Zayat, all milling wheats. Again, in our establishment and our harvest windows, it gives us a bit of flexibility. Generally speaking, we're using variable seeding to try and achieve a level that is a consistent, well-established crop across a variety of soil types, even within the same field or block. We are trialling this year on the back of what, again, Henry and Peter have talked about, nitrogen inhibitors to try and get better utilization of our nitrogen that we apply. I think we as milling wheat growers, or as wheat growers anywhere, a robust fungicide strategy generally has a very good payback, and it gives an assured harvest quality. So I think that as milling wheat, practical milling wheat growers, we've still got to sort of stick to the regimes that we understand, but also use the technology that is out there. The end sensor that we've got on our sprayer gives us the opportunity to variably apply both nitrogen and also some of our sort of fungicide and PGR programs. Next slide, please, Amanda. So what next? I think everybody is got ELMS and the thought process that the single farm payment is going to not exist very soon. What does it all mean for us? I think it is not completely clear cut. With what Henry's talked about, with DEFRA looking long and hard at our utilization of all the inputs that we use to grow our wheat, and we know we're going to have reduced incomes. It is going to be a very challenging period of time over the next 5 to 10 years. So let's hope we are well suited to do what we do and do it as well as we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Ian. Really interesting there. Absolutely, I concur with a lot of the points you've raised on that, on the growing of milling wheats. They're not grown for their agronomic capabilities. They're grown there for what they can produce and the qualities of the grain they produce for making bread. Interesting looking at the figures as well. You had 2019 an average of 10.6 tonne a hectare at 167. That comes out at 1,770 pounds a hectare output, and last year sold at this year sold at 200 pounds, but 7.75, so only 15.50 a hectare. So it just shows as well, even with milling wheats, yield is absolutely king. So we're having a little bit of a technical issue with, I can't see the questions that's been asked, but I have got them sent to me on WhatsApp. So the first question I have here is from Roger Sylvester Bradley. Of 86% of English rivers not reaching good ecological status, how many are due to farming, and how many nitrogen, in terms of nitrogen, and how many are due to phosphate? So I think that would be in your web there, Henry.
Yeah, I can try to answer that. Yeah, I can try to answer that then, Alex. Yeah. The answer probably is that a lot of them would be, but equally, it's not all going to be due to agriculture. Of course, eutrophication is caused by nitrogen and phosphorus, and there are many sources that could come from, and it will be different depending on which river and which catchment you look at. I think the point I was trying to make is we do need to be aware of these problems. Not saying that nitrogen is going to be the cause of all of them at all. I think it actually would take a better approach looking at each catchment individually, and obviously some catchments have had quite a lot of work through some of the nitrate regulations, looking at MVZs and things like that, to monitor those better, because again, without the metrics, without the data of knowing this is exactly the problem here and this is exactly the problem there, it might be that nitrogen and phosphorus is causing the problem, depending. So hope that helps.
Thanks, Henry. And again, sorry, keep putting you on the spot, again from Roger. As Peter is showing, there is significant scope to reduce protein in foods, livestock feeds and the crops we grow, have you thought to incentivise these reductions in protein contents of crop produce and livestock feeds? So again to you, Henry.
I think, in terms of incentives, of course, we're only at the beginning of starting the national pilot in terms of ELM and looking at the sustainable farming incentive. I believe the Secretary of State was talking just this morning at the NFU conference online about next steps and plans for that. And we would like to look at all of these options if there is a scope for doing something like that and improving and having a benefit directly to those sort of environmental outcomes, then it could be in scope for those sorts of things. One thing that we do need to make sure is that does that give a direct link to a reduction in use. You can't incentivize something if then actually it doesn't give that outcome. We do need to make sure of that.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Just one open to the panel, really. Does fungicide application inhibit protein development? My comment on that would be, if fungicide application reduces yield, it's going to increase protein through reduction in dilution effect. But throw it open to the panel. Comments, please. Does fungicide application inhibit protein development?
I would think not. I would think that anything that enhances the plant's ability to continue to capture both nutrients through its root system, through the storage from its stem, base sugars, and also still continue to photosynthesize for however much longer, I would suggest that it's going to be an improvement to its utilization of all the inputs that you're putting in to the plant.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks for that. Question for Peter. Do you see alternative breeding techniques such as gene editing as a potential tool to enhance nitrogen utilization efficiency, which current limited genetic variation of the elite wheat does not seem to provide?
Well, at the moment, I don't think we have the targets. I mean, I think gene editing is incredibly powerful. It will be used in the future, but you do need to know the gene targets. You need to know what you want to do. And I think we're not at that position yet. I mean, I think the most interesting thing we're working at the moment is the GPD, because we do have evidence that it's genetically determined. On the other hand, it's not very easy to work on because you need to do a lot of work with yield plots. So it's a lot of field work. You have to allow for sort of variation from year to year, and the only way we approach is a classical genetic approach, looking at crosses which exhibit GPD and growing them in multiple field sites. There may be more molecular ways into it at the moment, but I don't think there are. But yeah, in the future, but not at the moment. The answer.
Yeah, I mean, from a practical point of view, as a grower, since I've switched to growing Crusoe, we are much more consistent in achieving the 13% protein in the absence of new fall or anything like that than we would have been with any of the other milling varieties. So thanks for that. Just another question.
I think the other problem which you mentioned is stability. I mean, someone was mentioned changing climate, and stability is probably more important than intrinsic yield or intrinsic quality at the moment. And again, it's very difficult genetically, but there are differences in stability. You say Crusoe is more stable in your hands. I think there's evidence that other varieties are heavy wood used to be in the past. And I think someone needs to get to grips with actually determining what makes them more stable.
Yep, definitely. Another question: what changes were there in varieties over this period, knowing that varieties like Crusoe tend to be more efficient at forming protein?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but by what changes? Not sure what the changes means. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think genetic variation, the changes over time. That's all. Like you touched on Hereward. Hereward, I would understand that because the yield potential of it was so much lower.
Obviously, they are changing. We do. I mean, we do know quite a bit about molecular markers and things like this, but they're still relatively closely related. So no one's gone out in the UK to get away from the the gene pool we use to specifically look for low protein performance, say the way they have in Germany. So I think they're still, on the whole, they're pretty closely related, but it's not a question we've asked.
No. Okay, thanks for that. One for Ian. Could you have increased the gross margin with a rotation, including some legume crops, rather than your increased NPK applications?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't sort of state that we sort of grow 200 to 220 hectares of beans as well. It's part of the rotation. I mean, it used to be wheat, rape here because of the use of digestate and fig slurry. We brought beans in because of the inconsistencies of oilseed rape and the reliance on trying to sort of make first wheats are still statistically significantly our best gross margin, and so we do grow beans. Bean yields last year were poor compared to the year before. We know that in reality, on a gross margin terms, a good crop of oilseed rape will out yield any other pulse, whether it's peas or beans. But yeah, we're trying to sort of look long and hard, and I think this is where elms come into play, to be fair, Alex, is that we've got to see where that features in reducing our ability to lose money on some of the areas that are not good for break crops.
I mean, from that, what your comment is, I mean, from experience, the legume break crop as a break crop, we can't grow it more than 1 year in 6 or 7 without a real issue of it falling off a yield plateau, off a cliff. I think that looking at your soil type where you are, your organic manures is a brilliant way forward, because when you look at, as an example, look at the farm buildings there is still in Bedfordshire, Northamptonshire, they're all mixed farm buildings, because traditionally over the last 200 years they were all mixed farms. And I think you with your organic manure policy applications, you are a form of mixed farming. So for me, I think that's definitely the way forward. Another question on the economics: should the millers pay a premium for growing varieties that are more efficient at using N? Probably one for Peter there.
I think you should really ask the millers that. And
right,
I suspect it will vary from year to year, but it's not an answer I can give, to be honest with you.
And I mean, also Henry, comments on that question, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is part of what I was talking about at the end, about working together with all parts of the sector, because if we can see that there's scope there to, encourage millers in some way to choose better, more efficient plant varieties, then obviously that would be a good thing. But it is difficult, in terms of how do you get that, and how do you get everyone working on the same goal?
Yeah. Thanks for that. One I was going to ask as well, Ian, is in terms of your economic comparisons, gross margin wise, how did the spring barley compare to the Skyfall that was late drilled?
For me, it was a no-brainer. We had to buy all our spring barley seed. That's the first thing. Whereas we always grow, and we grow seed in first wheat situations, and we home save C1 seed for a commercial on a commercial basis. The other part of it is that the spring barley, from a storage point of view, is a nuisance. So anything that is not wheat or oilseed rape or beans is a nuisance, and also it always trades at a negative to feed wheat, let alone milling wheat. So we achieved an average of just under 6 tons on our spring barley. And if you say, well, it would be 140 pounds to 160 pounds a ton now, our milling wheat, we've got milling wheat still to sell. So whilst we've sort of an average at the moment of 200 pounds a ton, milling wheat, that's only going to go up. So for me, I've still got 250 hectares of wheat to go in. It's going to be Skyfall.
Yeah, and it's a lot less itchy than dealing with barley as well.
Oh, without a doubt. And to be fair, spring barley was a nightmare to harvest this season. We had, even though we'd Rounduped it, we had a lot of brackling. I would say that 15% of the yield was on the ground.
Yeah, we had those 2 storms that hit actually spring wheat and, more importantly, spring barley really badly. From us in the Fens, however, growing spring barley, we can grow consistently. Certainly, we grow 8 ton a hectare, sometimes 10. So we do get better yields with it. But I'm with you. I don't like the itchiness of barley. A question: does DEFRA understand the relative environmental impact of achieving protein in the UK, or of transporting as an alternative high protein wheat in from abroad?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I would say yes, because it's really a pollution swapping issue, isn't it? You know, do we produce more food here and do it to a better environmental standard and you know, fund that somehow, or do we import more from abroad where we don't have the control over the standards that it's grown to? I think that's part of a much bigger issue, and I guess again, it's this integrating things together between food policy, food strategy, getting consumers into this as well as then, you know, the environmental aspects of production and the economics around it. It's a very complicated issue, but yeah, I mean, certainly aware of these sorts of challenges.
Brilliant. Okay, so final question before we wrap up, and I'll have a comment on this before I throw it open. So do we think we can achieve high protein off lower N rates? Well, from my point of view, yes, I think we can. I think it's a lot to do with genetics, as we've touched on already today. I think fertiliser choice and the type of fertiliser used, again, when we look at nitrogen utilisation efficiency, well, consistent uptake means moving away from things like urea-based fertilisers. I think there you can take 25–30% off your total N requirements. But I'll throw it open to comment to the panel. Do we think we can achieve high protein off lower N rates?
Well, we had a Danish pig manager until recently, and we had a group of Danish farmers come over 3–4 years ago, and their NMAX for a milling winter wheat was 170 kilos, but they were allowed to put 40 kilos into the seed bed. They had that flexibility. They were also selling milling wheat into their market at a lower protein than we have to achieve. So I think it's down to the end user part of this. I also think it is down to the fact that in my slide you saw that yield. We all feed our crops for a particular yield with the knowledge that you have based on good sort of ICM, and then it doesn't achieve that. Therefore, you either get protein dilution when you have a successful year, or you have a high protein because you fed for a higher yield. That's the vagaries of farming in the UK, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. Any other comments from the panel?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I think I. Go on, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's achievable, but I think you need to optimise other aspects of quality, because we're very obsessed with protein quality, but there are other aspects we tend to neglect. And I think also we come back to stability. If it's not stable from year to year, I think the millers will build in a safety net and then ask for more protein, because if you have more protein, it can compensate to some extent for poor quality protein. So I think we come back to good stable varieties with stable quality from year to year.
Yeah, Henry.
Yeah, I was sort of going to say a similar thing in terms of the stability. I think clearly there's room to improve on efficiency, but with these aspects of extreme weather happening and external factors, I think it's not realistic to think that every field of milling wheat could be grown with lower. I think it's a case by case scenario, and it's just trying to find a way to make that more effective. And also it's managing risk, isn't it, at the farm level? You know, sometimes a lower input crop might be better for the gross margin, but sometimes it's not. It's variable. So I think that's all I'd say on it.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. So, you know, just in wrapping this session up, I found it very interesting. Henry's sort of giving us the goals that we should be aiming to achieve and keep under the environmental banner and to make the job sustainable. In terms of, from Peter, the real detail about what we're actually trying to grow and the potential genetics and developments going forward that might assist us in achieving that with lower nitrogen. And then brilliant from Ian, just looking at the detail, the practice, what's involved in producing what is a specialist wheat. I'm glad it is a specialist wheat because not everybody can grow it. If they could, we wouldn't be getting a premium for it. And personally, from my point of view, I think it's more interesting growing milling wheats than feed wheats, but I'll probably get told off for that one. And thank you all for speaking. It's been really interesting, and thanks for everyone for attending. Call the session closed.
Just a few final points from me. Thank you. On behalf of AHDB, I want to thank all of our speakers, Henry and Peter and Ian, and also very much to Alex, our chair for today. I think, as you will notice, various of the coach with quite serious adversity in terms of trying to sort the questions out and the cameras and stuff like that. So well done all, and thank you. To everyone else, please could I ask you to complete the feedback survey. It will appear on your screen after the webinar ends. And the recording of the webinar will be sent to you within 24 hours and the slides will be made available online. If you'd like to collect basis and ROSO points for the webinar, please download the forms. You'll find it in the handout section, and then you can return it to the events email. Otherwise, it will be sent to you afterwards. Well, the next webinar in the Milling Wheat series is tomorrow. It's Supply Chain and Policy. And then on Thursday, it's the Yen Wheat Quality Awards, when you have a chance to hear from the 3 top winning entries. And to book for those, please see the events page on the AHDB website. And can I just mention as a bonus, on Friday, you can join in the Oilseed webinar at 11 o'clock. We're doing with them jointly with United Oilseeds. Finally from me, thank you for joining us. Goodbye.